Hi friends, this is Miss Tara with another edition of Bedtime Stories. The Wind in the Willows. We're on chapter 5, which is called Dulce Damum. The sheep ran huddling together against the hurdles, blowing out thin nostrils and stamping with delicate forefeet, their heads thrown back and a light steam rising from the crowded sheep pen into a frosty air. As the two animals hastened by in high spirits with much chatter and laughter. They were returning across country after a long day's outing with Otter, hunting and exploring on the wide uplands where certain streams tributary to their own river had their first small beginnings, and the shades of the short winter day were closing in on them, and they had still some distance to go. Plodding at random across the plow, they had heard that the sheep had made for them. And now, leading from the sheep pen, they found a beaten track that made walking a lighter business, and responded moreover to the light inquiring something which all animals carry inside them, saying unmistakably, "Yes, quite right, this leads home." "It looks as if we're coming to a village," said the mole somewhat dubiously, slackening his pace as the track, that had this time become a path, and then had developed into a lane, and now headed over them to the charge of a well-maintained road. The animals did not hold with villages, and their own highways, thickly frequented as they were, took an independent course, regardless of church, post office, or public house. "Oh, never mind," said the rat. "At this season of the year, they're all safe indoors by this time, sitting around the fire, men, women, and children, dogs and cats and all. We shall slip right through all right, without any bother or unpleasantness, and we can have a look at them through their windows if you like and see what they're doing." The rapid nightfall of mid-December had quite bested the little village as they approached it on soft feet over a first thin fall of powdery snow. Little was visible but squares of dusky orange on either side of the street, where the firelight or lamp side of each cottage overflowed through the casements into the dark world without. Most of the low lattice windows were innocent of blinds, and to the lookers in from outside, the inmates gathered round the tea table, absorbed in handiwork or talking with laughter and gesture. Each had the happy grace which was the last thing the skilled actor shall capture, the natural grace which goes with perfect unconsciousness of observation. Moving at will from one theater to another, the two spectators, so far from home themselves, had something of wistfulness in their eyes as they watched a cat being stroked, a sleepy child picked up and huddled off to bed, or a tired man stretch and knock out his pipe at the end of a smoldering log. But it was from one little window, with its blind drawn down, a mere blank transparency of the night, that a sense of home, the little curtained world within the walls, the larger stressful world of the outside nature shut out and forgotten. Most pulsated close against the white blind hung a birdcage, clearly silhouetted, every wire, perch and appearance distinct and recognizable, even to yesterday's dull-edged lump of sugar. On the middle perch, the fluffy occupant, head tucked well into its feathers, seemed so near to them as to be easily stroked had they tried. Even delicate tips of his plumped-out plumage penciled plainly on the illustrated screen. As they looked, the sleepy little fellow stirred uneasily, woke, shook himself, and raised his head. They could see the gape of his tiny beak as he yawned in a bored sort of way, looked around, and then settled his head into his back again, while the ruffled feathers gradually subsided into perfect stillness. Then a gust of bitter wind took them in the back of the neck. A small sting of frozen sleet on the skin woke them as from a dream. They knew their toes could be cold and their legs tired, and their own home distant in a weary way. Once beyond the village, where the cottages ceased abruptly on either side of the road, they could smell through the darkness the friendly fields again. They braced themselves for the long last stretch, the home stretch, the stretch that we know is bound to end, sometime, in the rattle of the door latch, the sudden firelight, the sight of familiar things greeting us long-absent travelers from far over sea. They plodded along steadily and silently, each of them thinking his own thoughts. The moles ran a good deal on supper, as it was pitch dark, and it was all a strange country to him as far as he knew. He was following obediently in the wake of the rat, leaving the guidance entirely to him. As for the rat, he was walking a little way ahead, as is his habit, his shoulders humped, his eyes fixed on the straight gray road in front of him. He did not notice poor Mole when suddenly the summons reached him and took him like an electric shock. We others have a long lost the more subtle of physical senses, have not even proper terms to express an animal's intercommunications while with his surroundings, living or otherwise, and have only the word smell, for instance, to include a whole range of delicate thrills which murmur in the nose of the animal night and day, summoning, warning, inciting, and repelling. It was one of these mysterious fairy calls from the void that suddenly reached Mole in the darkness, making him tingle through and through with its very familiar appeal, even while as yet he could not clearly remember what it was. He stopped dead in his tracks, his nose searching hither and thither in its efforts to recapture the fine filament, the telegraphic current that had so strongly moved him. A moment that he had caught it again, and with its time came recollection in fullest flood. Home! That's what they meant, those caressing appeals, those soft touches wafted through the air, those invisible litter hands pulling and tugging all one way. Why, it must be quite close by him at the moment, his old home that he had hurriedly forsaken and never sought again. The day when he first found the river, and now it was sending out scouts and messengers to capture him and bring him in. Since his escape on the bright morning, he had hardly given it a thought. So absorbed he had been in his new life and all its pleasures, its surprises, its fresh and captivating experiences. Now, with the rush of old memories, how clearly it stood before him in the darkness. Shabby indeed, the small and poorly furnished, and yet his, the home he had made for himself, the home he had been so happy to get back to after his hard day's work. And the home had been happy with him, too, evidently, and was missing him and wanted him back, and was telling him so through his nose. Sorrowfully, reproachfully, with no bitterness or anger, only with plaintive reminder that it was there and wanted him. The call was clear, the summons was plain. He must obey it and go. "Ratty!" he called, full of joy and excitement. "Hold on! Come back! I want you, quick!" "Oh, come along, Mole, do," said the rat cheerfully, plodding along. "Please stop, Ratty," pleaded the poor Mole in anguish of heart. "You don't understand. It's my home. It's my old home. I've come across the smell of it, and it's close by here, really quite close. I must go in it. I must. Oh, come back, Ratty. Please come back." The rat was by this time very far ahead, too far to hear clearly what the mole was calling, too far to catch his sharp note of painful appeal in his voice. And he was much taken up with the weather, for he too could smell something suspiciously like approaching snow. "Mole, we mustn't stop now, really," he called back. "We'll come for it tomorrow, whatever it is you found, but I daren't stop now. It's late, and the snow's coming on again. I'm sure of it the way. And I want your nose, Mole, so come on quick, there's a good fellow." And the rat pressed forward on his way without waiting for an answer. Poor Mole now stood alone in the road, his heart torn asunder, a big giant sob gathering somewhere low down deep inside him to leap up to the surface presently. He knew in passionate escape. But even under such a test as to the loyalty of his friend, he stood firm. Never a dull moment did his dream of abandoning him. Meanwhile, the wafts of his old home pleaded, whispered, conjured, and finally claimed imperiously. He dared not tarry longer within the magic circle. With a wrench that tore his very heartstrings, he set his face down in the road, followed submissively in the track of Rat, while faint, thin little smell still dogging his retreating nose, reproached him from his new friendship and callous forgetfulness. With an effort, he caught up to the unsuspecting rat, who had been chattering cheerfully about what they would do when they got back, and how jolly a fire of logs in the parlor would be, and what a supper he meant to eat, never noticing his companion's silence and distrustful state of mind. At last, however, when they had gone some comfortable way further and were passing the tree stumps at the edge of the copse that bordered the road, he stopped and said kindly, "Look here, Mole, old chap, you seem dead tired. No talk left in you, and your feet dragging like lead. We'll sit down here for a minute and rest. The snow has held off so far, and that's the best part of our journey is over." The mole subsided forlornly on a tree stump and tried to control himself, for he felt it surely coming. The sob he had fought so long refused to be beaten. Up and up it forced its way to the air, then another, and others thick and fast, till poor Mole gave up the struggle and cried freely and helplessly and openly now that he knew it was all over, and he had lost what he could hardly be said to have found. The rat, astonished and dismayed at the violence of Mole's paroxysm of grief, did not dare to speak for a while. At last he said very quietly and sympathetically, "What is it, old fellow? Whatever can be the matter? Tell us your trouble and let me see what I can do." Poor Mole found it difficult to get any words out between the upheavals of his chest that followed one upon another so quickly that he barely held speech and choked as it came. "I know it's a shabby, dingy place," he sobbed forth at last brokenly. "Not like your cozy quarters, or Toad's beautiful hall, or Badger's great house. But it was my own little home, and I was fond of it, and it went away, and I forgot all about it, and then I smelt it suddenly on the road, and I called and you wouldn't listen, Rat. Everything came back to me with a rush, and I wanted it. Oh dear, and when you wouldn't turn back, Ratty, I just had to leave it. I thought I was smelling it all the time. I thought my heart would break. We might have just gone back and had one look at Ratty. Only one look. It was close by, but you wouldn't turn back, Ratty. You wouldn't turn back. Oh dear, oh dear." Recollection brought fresh waves of sorrow, and sobs took full charge of him, preventing further speech. The rat stared straight in front of him, saying nothing, only patting Mole gently on the shoulder. And after a time he muttered gloomily, "I see it all now. What a pig I have been. A pig, that's me. Just a pig, a plain pig." He waited till Mole's sobs became gradually less stormy and more rhythmical. He waited until the last sniffs were frequent and sobs were only intermittent. Then he rose from his seat, remarking carelessly, "Well, now, we'd really better be getting on, old chap." Set up the road again over some toilsome way they had come. "Whatever you are going to, Ratty," cried the tearful Mole, looking up in alarm. "We're going to find the home of yours, old fellow," replied the rat pleasantly, "so you had better come along. It'll take some finding, and we shall want your nose." "Oh, come back, Ratty, do," cried the Mole, getting up after hurrying after him. "It's no good, I tell you. It's too late, too dark, and the place far off, and the snow's coming. And I never meant to let you know I was feeling that way about it. And it was all an accident and a mistake. And think of the riverbed and your supper." "Hang Riverbank and supper too," said the rat heartily. "I tell you I'm going to find this place now if I stay out all night. So cheer up, old chap, and take my arm. We'll very soon be back there again." Still snuffling, pleading, and reluctant, Mole suffered himself to be dragged back along the road by his imperious companion, by who a flow of cheerful talk and anecdote endeavored to beguile his spirits back and make the weary way seem shorter. When at last it seemed to the rat that they must be nearing the part of the road where the Mole had been held up, he said, "Now, no more talking business. Use your nose and give your mind to it." They moved on in silence for some little way, when suddenly the rat was conscious that his arm was linked in Mole's. Of a faint sort of electric thrill was passing down the animal's body. Instantly he detangled himself, fell back in a pace, and waited. Odd attention. The signals were coming through. Mole stood at a moment rigid, with his nose uplifted, quavering slightly, felt the air. Then a short, quick run forward, a halt, a check, a try back, then a slow, steady, confident advance. The rat, much excited, kept close to his heels as the Mole, with something of the air of a sleepwalking, crossed a dry ditch, scrambled through a hedge, nosed his way over a field, open, trackless and bare in the faint starlight. Suddenly, without giving warning, he dived, but the rat was on alert and promptly followed him down the tunnel to which his unerring nose had faithfully led him. It was close and airless. The earthy smell was strong, and it seemed a long time to Rat ere the passage ended, and he could stand erect and stretch and shake himself. The Mole struck a match. By its light the rat saw there was standing in an open space, neatly swept and sanded underfoot, and directly facing them was Mole's little front door, with Mole End painted in Gothic lettering over a bell pull at the side. Mole reached down a lantern from a nail on the wall and lit it, and the rat, looking round, him saw that they were in a forecourt. A garden seat stood on one side of the door, and on the other a roller, for the mole, who was a tidy animal when at home, could not stand having his ground kicked up by other animals in little runs that ended earth heaps. On the walls hung wire baskets with ferns in them, alternating with brackets carrying plaster statuary, Garibaldi and the infant Samuel and Queen Victoria and other heroes of modern Italy. Down one side of the forecourt ran a skittle alley with benches along it, and a little wooden table marked with rings that hinted at beer mugs. It was the middle of a small round pond containing goldfish, and surrounded by a cockleshell border. Out of the center of the pond rose a fanciful erection clothed in more cockleshells, and toppled by a large silver glass ball that reflected everything all wrong and had a very pleasing effect. The mole's face beamed at the sight of all those objects so dear to him, and he hurried Rat through the door, lit a lamp in the hall, and took one glance round his old home. He saw the dust collecting, lying thick on everything, saw a cheerless, deserted look of the long-neglected house and its narrow, meager dimensions, its worn and shabby contents, and collapsed again on the hall chair with his nose in his paws. "Oh, Ratty," he cried dismally, "why ever did I do it? Why did I bring you to this cold little place on a night like this, when you might have been at the river bank by this time, roasting your toes before a blazing fire, with all your own nice things about you?" The rat paid no heed to his doleful self-reproaches. He was running near and there, opening doors and inspecting rooms and cupboards, and lighting lamps and candles, and stacking them up everywhere. "What a capital little house this is," he called out cheerfully. "So compact, so well planned. Everything here and everything in its place. We'll make a jolly night of it. The first thing we want is a good fire. I'll see to that. I always know where to find things. So this is the parlor. Splendid. Your own idea, those little sleeping bunks in the wall. Capital! Now I'll fetch the wood and the coals, and you'll get a duster, Mole. You'll find one in the drawer of the kitchen table, and try to smarten things up a bit. Bustle about, old chap." Encouraged by his inspiring companion, the mole roused himself and dusted and polished with energy and heartiness, while the rat, running to and fro with armfuls of fuel, soon had to a cheerful blaze roaring up the chimney. He hailed the mole to come and warm himself, but Mole promptly had another fit of the blues, dropping down on a couch in dark despair and burying his face in a duster. "Rat," he moaned, "how about your supper, you poor, cold, hungry, weary animal? I have nothing to give you, nothing, not a crumb." "What a fellow are you for giving in," said the rat reproachfully. "Why, just now I saw a sardine opener on the kitchen dresser, quite distinctly, and everybody knows that means that there are sardines about somewhere in the neighborhood. Rouse yourself, pull yourself together, come with me and forage." They went and foraged accordingly, hunting through every cupboard and turning out every drawer. The result was not so very depressing after all, though of course it might have been better. A tin of sardines, a box of captain's biscuits, nearly full, and a German sausage encased in silver paper. "There's a banquet for you," observed the rat as he arranged the table. "I know some animals would give their ears to be sitting down to supper with us tonight." "No bread," Mole groaned dolorously. "No butter, no pâté foie gras, no champagne," continued Rat, grinning. "And that reminds me. What's the little door at the end of the passage? Your cellar, of course. Every luxury in the house. Just you wait a minute." He made for the cellar door, and presently reappeared, something dusty, a bottle of beer in each paw, another under each arm. "Self-indulgent beggar you seem to be, Mole," he observed. "Deny yourself nothing. This is really the jolliest little place I was ever in. Now, whatever you did to pick up those prints, make the place look home-like they do. No wonder you're so fond of it, Mole. Tell us about it, how you came to make it what it is." Then, while the rat busied himself fetching plates, knives, and forks, mustard in which he mixed in an egg cup, the mole, his bosom still heaving with the stress of the recent emotion, related, somewhat shyly at first, but with more freedom as he warmed to his subject, how this was planned, and how this was thought out, and how this got through a windfall from an ant, and that a wonderful find, a bargain, at this other thing was bought out of laborious savings, a certain amount of going without. His spirits finally quite restored, he must needs go and caress his possessions, and take the lamp to show off their points to his visitor, and expatiate on them, quite forgetful of the supper they both so much needed. Rat, who was so desperately hungry, but strove to conceal it, nodding seriously, examining with a puckered brow, and saying "Wonderful" and "Most remarkable" at intervals when the chance for an observation was given him. At last Rat succeeded in decoying him to the table, and had just got seriously to work with the sardine opener when the sounds he heard from the forecourt without, the sounds like the scuffling of small feet in the gravel, and the confused murmur of tiny voices, while broken sentences reached them. "Now all in a line. Now hold the lantern up a bit, Tommy. Clear your throats first. No coughing after I say 1, 2, 3. Where's young Bill? What's he come to? We're all a-waitin'." "What's up?" inquired the Rat, pausing his labors. "I think it must be the field mice," replied the Mole, with a touch of pride in his manner. "They go around carol singing regularly at this time of year. They're all quite an institution in these parts, and they never pass over me. They come to Mole End last of all, and I used to give them hot drinks and supper too sometimes when I could afford it. It will be like old times to hear them again." "Let's have a look at them," cried Rat, jumping up and running to the door. It was a pretty sight, a seasonable one, met their eyes when they flung the door open. In the forecourt, lit by the dim rays of a horn lantern, some 8 or 10 little field mice stood in a semicircle, red worsted comforters round their throats, their forepaws thrust deep into their pockets, and their feet jiggling for warmth. With bright, beady eyes, they glanced shyly at each other, sniggering a little, sniffing and applying coat sleeves, a good deal. When the door opened, one of the elder ones that carried a lantern was just saying, "Now then, 1, 2, 3, and forthwith their little shrill voices uprose in the air, singing one of the old-time carols that their forefathers composed in the fields that were fallow and held by frost, or when the snow bound in the chimney corners had handed down to be snug in the mire, street to lamplight window at Yule time." The voices ceased. The singers, bashful but smiling, exchanged sidelong glances, and silence succeeded, but for a moment only. Then from up above and far away down the tunnel they had so lightly traveled was borne into their ears in a faint musical hum, the sound of distant bells, ringing a joyful and clangorous peal. "Well sung, boys," the Rat said heartily, "and now come along in, all of you, and warm yourselves by the fire. We have something hot." "Yes, come along, field mice," cried Mole eagerly. "This is quite like old times. Shut the door after you. Pull up the settle to the fire. Now, just wait a minute while we—" "Oh, Ratty," he cried in despair, plumping down on the seat with tears impending. "Whatever are we doing? We've nothing to give them." "You leave that to me," said the masterful Rat. "Here you come with the lantern. Come over this way. I want to talk to you. Now tell me, are there any shops open at this hour of the night?" "Why, certainly, sir," replied the field mouse respectively. "At this time of the year our shops keep open all sorts of hours." "Then look here," said the Rat. "You go off at once, you and your lantern, and you get me—" Here much muttered conversation ensued, and the Mole only heard bits of it, such as "fresh mind, and no pound of that will do. See you get Buggins, for I won't have any other. No, only the best. If you can get there, try somewhere else. Yes, of course, homemade, no tin stuff. Well, then, do the best you can." Finally, there was a chink of coins passing from paw to paw. The field mice was provided with ample basket for his purchases, and off he hurried, he and his lantern. The rest of the field mice perched in a row on the settle, their small legs swinging, gave themselves the enjoyment of the fire, and toasted their chili beans till they tingled, while the Mole, failing to draw them into easy conversation, plunged into family history and made each of them recite the names of the numerous brothers, who were too young, it appeared, to be allowed to go out a-caroling this year, but looked forward very shortly to winning the parental consent. The Rat, meanwhile, was busily examining the label of one of his beer bottles. "I perceive this to be old Burton," he remarked approvingly. "Sensible, Mole, the very thing. Now we shall be able to mull some ale. Get some things ready, Mole, while I draw the corks." It didn't take long to prepare the brew and thrust the tin heater well into the red heart of the fire, and soon every field mouse was sipping and coughing and choking, for a little mulled ale goes a long way, and wiping his eyes and laughing and forgetting he had ever been cold in all his life. "The act plays, too, these fellows," the Mole explained to the Rat. make them up all by themselves, and act them afterward. Very well they do it, too. They gave us a capital one last year about a field mouse who was captured at sea by a Barbary corsair, made to row in a galley. And when he escaped and got home again, his lady love had gone into a convent. Here, you were in it, I remember. Get up and recite a bit. The field mouse addressed got up on his legs, giggled shyly, looked around the room, and remained absolutely tongue-tied. His comrades cheered him on. Mole coaxed and encouraged him, and the rat went as far as to take him by the shoulders and shake him, but nothing was to overcome his stage fright. They were all busily engaged on, like watermen, applying the Royal Humane Society's regulations to a case of long submersion, when the latch clicked and the door opened, and the field mouse with the lanterns reappeared, staggering under the weight of his basket. There was more talk of play acting, once the very real and solid contents of the basket had been tumbled out onto the table. Under great generalship of Rat, everyone was set to do something or to fetch something. In a very few minutes supper was ready, and Mole, as he took to the head of the table in a sort of dream, saw a lately barren board to set thick with savory comforts, saw his little friends' faces brighten up and beam as they fell to without delay, and then let himself loose, for he was famished indeed, onto the provender so magically provoked, thinking it was a happy homecoming as he had turned out after all. As they ate, they talked of old times, and the field mice gave the local gossip up to date, and answered as well as they could the 100 questions he asked of them. The rat said little or nothing, only taking care that each guest had what he wanted, and plenty of it, and the mole had no trouble or anxiety about anything. They clattered off at last, very grateful and showering wishes of the season, their jacket pockets stuffed with remembrances for the small brothers and sisters at home. When the door had closed on the last of them and the chink of the lanterns had died away, Mole and Rat kicked the fire up, drew their chairs in, and brewed themselves a late-night cap of mulled ale, and discussed the events of the long day. At last, Rat was with a tremendous yawn, said, "Oh, Mole, old chap, I'm ready to drop. Sleepy is not the word. Your own bunk over on that side? Very well, then I'll take this. What a ripping little house it is. Everything so handy." He clambered into his bunk and rolled himself well up in the blankets, and slumber gathered him forthwith in a swath of barley folded into the arms of the reaping machine. The weary mole was so glad to turn in without delay, and soon his head was on his pillow in great joy and contentment. But ere he closed his eyes and let them wander round his old room, mellow in the glow of the firelight that played or rested on familiar and friendly things, which had long been unconsciously part of him, and now, smiling, received him back without recour. He was now in just the frame of mind that the tactful rat had quietly worked to bring in about him. He saw clearly how plain and simple, how narrow even, it all was, but clearly, too, how much it meant to him, and the special value of such anchorage in one existence. He did not at all want to abandon the new life and its splendid spaces, to turn his back on sun and air, and all they offered to him, and creep home and stay there. The upper world was all too strong. It called to him even down there. He knew he must return to the larger stage. But it was good to think he had this to come back to, a place which was all his own, these things which were so glad to see him again, and could always be counted upon for the same simple welcome. Well, friends, that's the end of Chapter 5. We'll see you next time for Chapter 6. But until then, sweet dreams. Good night.